Close your eyes and let the restless, demanding noise of the modern world fade into the background. Let the tensions of your day dissolve, and imagine the gentle, persistent sound of a distant northern rain as you travel back, with me, across 1,000 years, to a landscape defined by silence and deep, eternal frost. Our destination is 9th century Scandinavia, but we are not here to witness blood-soaked raids or the chaotic clashing of steel. Tonight, we explore a story that is much quieter, much slower, and ultimately far more profound. It is a story of incredible human endurance, of ordinary survival, and of an impossible dream that stretched across 3,000 miles of impenetrable forest. To truly understand this journey, we must first sink into the atmosphere of the frozen north, a place that was quiet, profoundly isolated, and, by almost all modern standards, incredibly boring. Picture the deep, static stillness of a Scandinavian fjord in the dead of winter. The water is as black and stagnant as ink, framed by towering, monumental cliffs of gray stone and ancient, heavy pine trees bending under an immense, suffocating weight of snow. There are no grand stone cities here. There are no bustling marketplaces filled with colorful eastern spices or the noise of foreign tongues. There is only the bitter, merciless wind howling through small, isolated settlements of simple wooden longhouses, half buried in the earth to keep out the piercing cold. Inside these longhouses, dark, cramped, and perpetually filled with the thick, acrid smoke of a slow-burning peat fire, families lived out an ordinary, unremarkable existence that shifted very little from one cold generation to the next. For months on end, when the weak winter sun barely rose above the gray horizon, there was nowhere to go. There was nothing new to see. The world outside was a dangerous, freezing wasteland, and the world inside was a slow, repetitive, and often miserable test of human endurance. We must let our minds linger on what it was truly like to exist in that endless routine. It was a miserable struggle, not just against starvation, but against the sheer, heavy boredom of daily survival. Men sat by the flickering fire for hours, slowly and methodically carving wooden rudders, repairing tattered nets, or sharpening the same old iron tools that had been passed down from their grandfathers. Women spun coarse wool into thick, heavy, scratchy clothing, their hands rough and calloused from the endless, ordinary labor of keeping a family alive in a land that seemed to want nothing more than to freeze them to death. Their everyday life was measured not by grand achievements, but by simple, brutal survival. They ate the same bland food day after day, year after year: dried fish, heavily salted meat, and hard, sour barley bread. There was no pool of precious metals or gems hidden beneath the rough floorboards. Wealth was not about gold. It was about the number of cattle, the store of grain, and the raw ability to see the spring sun rise once again. But beneath this boring, miserable predictability, a quiet and desperate tension was growing. The population of these narrow northern valleys was expanding, but the rocky, frozen soil of Scandinavia could not expand with them. Arable land was tight, squeezed between the vertical mountains and the deep sea. Younger sons, who would inherit nothing from their fathers, sat by the longhouse fires and looked out toward the eastern horizon. They knew that if they stayed, their lives would remain a predictable cycle of poverty and ordinary labor. And so, their restless eyes turned to the only highway they had ever truly known: the water. For decades, the Western Vikings had looked toward the open, violent waves of the Atlantic Ocean. They built their famous longships to cut through the heavy surf, landing on the soft, vulnerable shores of England and France. Their path was one of sudden violence and rapid retreat. But on the eastern shores of Scandinavia, in what is now modern-day Sweden, a different group of people looked across the calm, dark, and placid waters of the Baltic Sea. These people were known as the Russ. They were farmers and hunters, but above all, they were master navigators of rivers rather than the open ocean. They were not drawn to the empty, terrifying horizon of the West. Instead, they were drawn to the mysterious, slow-moving river mouths that emptied into the eastern Baltic. Beyond this sea lay a vast, seemingly endless wilderness, a dark, impenetrable, and silent sea of ancient pine, birch, and oak that stretched for thousands of miles into the deep heart of Europe. This was the land of the Slavs, a quiet, agricultural people who lived in small, scattered timber villages along the muddy riverbanks. To an ordinary traveler, this wilderness was terrifying, impenetrable, and deeply miserable. It was a labyrinth of toxic swamps, dense thickets, and 1,000 shifting currents. But to the Russ, this wilderness was not a barrier. It was a map of golden possibilities. They realized that the massive, ancient rivers of this eastern land, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, and the mighty Volga, were liquid roads. They were liquid roads that pierced deep through the silent heart of the continent, flowing southward toward empires so wealthy and magnificent that they existed only as myths, in the boring, smoky longhouses of the frozen north. The challenge was that the ships built for the open ocean were too deep and too heavy for these shallow, unpredictable, and shifting rivers. To conquer these new, liquid roads, the Russ had to develop a new kind of vessel. They looked at the ancient forests around them and pioneered the craft of the monoxylon, or the single-log boat. Imagine the incredible, ordinary labor of felling a massive, centuries-old oak tree in the deep silence of a Scandinavian winter. Working with heavy iron axes, the Russ would carefully fell the giant. Then they would spend weeks in the freezing cold carefully hollowing out the interior, a boring, miserable, yet vital job. They burned the wood with controlled fires and chipped away the charcoal with adzes until they had created a long, light, and supernaturally strong hull. To this single log base, they would then add planks along the sides to raise the gunwales, creating a shallow draft vessel that could glide through waters just a few inches deep. These boats were small, narrow, and prioritized cargo space over any hint of comfort. For the men who climbed inside them, everyday life on the river was a brutal testament to human endurance and boring misery. There were no cabins. There was no protection from the sudden, violent rainstorms of the spring or the burning, mosquito-ridden heat of the deep forest summer. They slept on the hard, wooden rowing benches, their bodies perpetually aching from hours of relentless rowing against the heavy, sluggish river currents. It was a miserable, grinding existence, far removed from any modern romantic notion of glory. This was the slow, exhausting grind of a merchant adventurer. They left the familiar waters of the Baltic behind and entered a complex network of riverways that would test their resourcefulness, their sanity, and their survival to the absolute limit. They moved slowly, mile by painful mile, through the silent, endless green of the forest, surrounded by the constant, monotonous rhythm of dipping oars and the soft, rhythmic creak of wet, strained wood, But they endured this ordinary misery because of what was hidden in their cargo, holds. They were not carrying gold or silver, not yet. They were carrying the raw, natural luxuries of the northern wilderness, commodities that were ordinary to them, but worth a fortune in the wealthy markets of the distant south. Inside the narrow holds of the Russ single-log boats lay three primary goods. The first was fur. In the 9th century, Europe and the magnificent courts of the Middle East were experiencing a desperate need for luxury pelts. The deep, dark forests of northern Europe were home to the finest fur-bearing animals in the world. The marten, the beaver, the silver fox, and above all, the sable. To an ordinary northern hunter, tracking these animals through the deep, silent snow was a routine, everyday life occurrence. It was cold, boring, and intensely lonely work. But the pelts they harvested were thick, incredibly soft, and possessed a brilliant, glossy sheen that could not be replicated anywhere else. In the magnificent courts of Baghdad and Constantinople, where the elite lived in luxury but shivered during the winter months, these northern furs were worn as symbols of absolute power and wealth. A single coat made of deep black northern sable was worth more than an ordinary man could earn in a decade of miserable farming. The second cargo was honey and beeswax. In a world before refined sugar and electricity, these two ordinary substances were incredibly precious. Honey was the primary sweetener for food and wine across the Mediterranean. Beeswax was even more vital for religious life. The vast Christian churches of the Byzantine Empire consumed immense quantities of wax every single day. Thousands of candles burned continuously in the dark, magnificent, golden interiors of St. Sophia and a thousand other basilicas, filling the heavy air with the scent of prayers. The Rus gathered this wax from the wild hives of the endless Slavic forests, packing it into tight, heavy barrels that filled their boats with a sweet, heavy aroma that mixed with the constant smell of sweat and dried fish. The third cargo, however, was the most valuable and the most tragic. It was human beings. The Rus were not just merchants of objects, they were slave traders. As they moved down the riverways, they used their superior weapons and iron discipline to capture the local Slavic populations. They raided isolated forests, settlements, tearing young men and women away from their ordinary, everyday life, forever. For these captives, the journey was a miserable, terrifying descent into a living nightmare. They were chained together in the hot, cramped bellies of the monoxylons, forced to endure the long, slow journey down the riverways without knowing where they were going or if they would ever see their forest homes again. The Rus treated them not as people, but as livestock, a highly profitable, self-replicating commodity that was in high demand in the great slave markets of the South. With their boats laden to the absolute limit with these heavy pelts, barrels of wax, and lines of chained captives, the Rus pushed further into the unknown. They had to find a center, a safe outpost to organize this burgeoning trade. Their solution was to build their first great commercial empire on a foundation of mud and timber in a place that would become known as Staraya Ladoga. Let the noise of the modern world fade away completely as you sink deeper into this story, a story of an ordinary people who did an impossible thing on the endless, golden riverways of the East. This single outpost of Staraya Ladoga was the key to unlocking the rivers of gold. It was a place where the ordinary, miserable wilderness was transformed into a bustling engine of global commerce. It wasn't magnificent, but it was successful, and it gave the Rus the strength and the base they needed to continue there. Slow, relentless journey southward, navigating the liquid roads that would eventually lead them to the very heart of the wealthiest empire on earth, to the legendary city they called the City of the Kings. The journey was long, and the river currents were sluggish and heavy, but as they rode deeper into the heart of the Slavic wilderness, they left the ordinary Scandinavia behind and began to create a new kind of world, a world where the frozen north met the golden south on the rivers of gold. Let your breathing slow down even further. Feel the weight of the night settling around you as we slip back into the timeless rhythm of the eastern rivers. We left our travelers at the lonely mud and timber outpost of Staraya Ladoga, where the damp air smelled of wet pine, heavy beeswax, and the cold, gray waters of the Volkhov River. But Ladoga was merely the edge of the world. Beyond it lay the true challenge, a vast, silent, and green labyrinth that felt less like an adventure and more like an endless, boring trial of human patience. To truly understand what it was like to push deeper into this territory, you must strip away all modern notions of travel. There were no maps, no markers, and no guarantees of survival. The Rus merchants sat in their narrow single-log boats, their muscles aching from a routine that had become their entire everyday life. Day after day, the scenery never changed. To the left, a wall of dark, ancient pine trees. To the right, the exact same wall of dark pine trees. The water beneath them moved with a slow, sluggish indifference, forcing them to rely on the pure, brutal strength of their arms to make even a few miles of progress before the weak sun dipped below the tree line. This was the profound reality of their journey. It was intensely boring. For weeks, on end, the only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotic splash of wooden oars cutting through the dark water, and the constant, low murmur of men speaking in tired, hushed voices. The romantic illusions of grand conquests vanished into the thick forest mist, replaced by the miserable reality of wet clothes, blistered hands, and the relentless biting of summer mosquitoes that swarmed over the stagnant swamps. This wasn't a world of sudden glory. It was a world of ordinary, exhausting labor that wore down the spirit just as much as it wore down the body. As the Rus pushed further south along the Volkhov River, they eventually reached a vast, shallow expanse of water known as Lake Ilmen. Here, the horizon widened slightly, offering a brief relief from the claustrophobic walls of the forest, but the vulnerability of their small boats became even more apparent. On this lake, the weather could turn in an instant. A sudden, violent squall could whip the shallow water into a chaotic trap, threatening to flip the heavy, cargo-laden monoxylons and send their precious furs and chained captives to the muddy bottom. Survival in these moments didn't require heroic warrior charges. It required the ordinary, cold calculations of seasoned sailors who knew how to read the gray clouds and steady a tipping hull. On the southern shores of this lake, the Rus established another vital anchor for their growing network, a place that would become known as Novgorod or Holmgard in their own tongue. In these early days, Novgorod was not the grand, powerful republic of later centuries. It was a rugged, muddy settlement built entirely of heavy logs surrounded by a simple wooden palisade. The everyday life here was defined by the constant smell of wood smoke and the squelch of thick mud underfoot. It was a miserable place to winter, a spot where the freezing cold would lock thee, rivers in solid ice for months, forcing the merchants to halt their journeys, huddle inside crowded timber longhouses, and wait out the dark, boring season just as they had done in Scandinavia. Yet, Novgorod became the melting pot where two distinct worlds began to blur into one. The Rus were not alone in this wilderness. They lived alongside, and often ruled over, the local Slavic and Finnish tribes. For the ordinary Slavic farmer, the arrival of these tall, iron-willed northerners was a strange and permanent disruption to their traditional everyday life. The Slavs were a people tied to the soil, living in small, isolated clearings where they grew rye and tended to their livestock. Their existence was already a difficult, often miserable struggle against the unyielding forest, but now they had to navigate the presence of a merchant, elite that demanded tribute in the form of their finest pelts, their sweet honey, and their own children. When the ice finally cracked and groaned in the warmth of the spring sun, the rivers came alive once again. The Rus would load their boats with the accumulated tribute from the winter months and prepare for the most treacherous stretch of the entire journey. They were moving toward the Dnieper River, the great liquid highway that led directly to the Black Sea. But getting from one river system to another was an ordinary nightmare of physical labor. The rivers did not perfectly connect. Between the riverbeds lay stretches of dry land, swamps, and hills, a geographical barrier known as the portages. Imagine what it was like to encounter a portage after weeks of monotonous rowing. The river would slowly narrow and become too shallow to navigate, clogged with rocks and fallen trees. The merchants had no choice but to pull their heavy, fully loaded monoxylons out of the water and onto the rough forest floor. Working in the humid, exhausting heat of the forest, they would cut down smaller birch trees to use as rollers. Then, using thick ropes made of horsehair or leather, they would manually drag these massive wooden boats across miles of uneven ground, mud, and sharp rocks. It was an unimaginably miserable and back-breaking process. The chains of the Slavic captives clanked heavily as they were forced to push the very vessels that carried them into slavery. One slip of a roller, one broken rope, could mean a crushed limb or a shattered hull, leaving a crew stranded in the middle of an unforgiving, hostile wilderness. There was no grandeur here, no songs of victory. There was only the sound of heavy panting, the cracking of whips, the groaning of strained timber, and the ordinary, slow movement of men conquering a continent by the sheer force of their muscles. Once they successfully crossed the portages and slid their boats back into the rushing waters of the upper Dnieper, the nature of the journey changed. The river grew wider, deeper, and faster. They were moving out of the northern pine forests and entering the transition zone where the trees began to thin, revealing the vast, rolling grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. But this shift in landscape brought a new kind of anxiety. In the forest, the danger was the environment itself, the boring isolation, the hidden rocks, the miserable weather. In the open steppe, the danger became human. The steppe was the domain of the nomadic tribes, most notably the Pechenegs. These were expert horsemen who lived a life entirely different from the forest dwellers or the northern merchants. They moved with the seasons, following their herds across the endless seas of grass. To the Pechenegs, a fleet of heavily laden, slow-moving Rus boats on the river was the ultimate target. They knew the river perfectly, and, more importantly, they knew exactly where the river was most vulnerable. That vulnerability lay at the Dnieper Rapids. For a stretch of nearly 40 miles, the mighty Dnieper River tore through a series of massive granite ridges, creating 7 distinct areas of roaring, chaotic white water and treacherous rocky steps. Here, the silent, hypnotic rhythm of the river journey was shattered by the deafening roar of churning water. The Russ could not row through these rapids. The rocks would rip their thin-hulled single-log boats to pieces in seconds. For each of the 7 rapids, the merchants had to make a high-stakes decision. At the smaller rapids, they could leave the cargo in the boats and carefully guide the vessels through the rocks using long poles, wading waist-deep into the freezing, violent current. This was ordinary, terrifying work where a single misstep meant being swept away and drowned. At the larger, more violent rapids, however, they had to pull the boats completely out of the water once again and carry them along the rocky riverbanks. And it was precisely here, at the edge of the roaring rapids, that the Pechenegs would wait in ambush, hidden in the tall grass of the steppe, watching the exhausted Russ merchants strain under the weight of their boats. The nomads would strike with sudden, terrifying speed, raining arrows down upon the vulnerable caravans. The Russ had to drop their ropes, draw their swords, and fight for their ordinary lives in the dirt, defending their furs, their wax, and their captives from a foe that could vanish back into the endless grasslands as quickly as they had appeared. To survive the Dnieper rapids was to survive a true crucible of human endurance. It was a place where the boring, predictable misery of the northern routine was replaced by moments of absolute, heart-stopping terror. Yet, year after year, driven by the quiet desperation of their frozen origins and the glittering promise of southern gold, the Russ made this journey. They paid the price in sweat, blood, and ordinary lives left behind in unmarked graves along the riverbanks. As the roar of the final rapids slowly faded behind them, the river widened into a peaceful, calm estuary, emptying into the vast, brackish waters of the Black Sea. For the first time in months, the merchants looked out at an open saltwater horizon. They had survived the forest, the portages, the nomads, and the rapids. Ahead of them lay the final stretch of their liquid highway, a journey across the sea toward a city that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. Breathe in the cool, salt air of the sea and let your mind rest, knowing that the endless green forest is finally behind us and the golden walls of the south are drawing near. Take a long, slow breath. Let the silence around you deepen as we step back onto the wooden gunwales of our small vessels, leaving the treacherous Dnieper rapids far behind. The roar of the crashing river water has completely vanished, replaced by a vast, profound quiet. The Russ merchants now find themselves floating on the boundless, deep blue expanse of the Black Sea. For men who spent their entire lives squeezed between the narrow rock walls of Scandinavian fjords or the suffocating density of the Slavic forests, this sudden explosion of open space was both magnificent and deeply disorienting. Sailing across the open sea brought a completely different kind of challenge, one that quickly dissolved into a boring, repetitive routine. On the rivers, every bend brought a potential ambush or a hidden rock. On the sea, there was nothing but the empty line where the gray water met the pale sky. Day after day, the wind filled their coarse wool sails, pulling the single log boats slowly southward. To understand what it was like to exist in this space, one must imagine the absolute monotony of their everyday life during this leg of the voyage. There were no landmarks to guide them, only the position of the pale sun by day and the cold alignment of the northern stars by night. The physical reality of this ocean crossing was often miserable. The fresh, sweet water they had drawn from the rivers slowly turned stagnant and foul in, their wooden barrels tasting heavily of rot and old oak. The salt spray from The sea waves crusted onto their skin and clothes, causing deep, painful chafing that could not be washed away. They ate the same ordinary, hard barley bread and strips of dried, salty fish that they had carried from Novgorod, their jaws, aching from the sheer effort of chewing. It was a slow, grinding test of human patience, far removed from any romantic poetry of sea kings. It was a boring, uncomfortable reality where survival depended entirely on the structural integrity of their hollowed-out tree trunks and the steady discipline of the crew. The Black Sea, however, was never truly a peaceful host. It was notorious for its sudden, violent autumn storms, tempests that could whip the dark waters into a churning, chaotic nightmare within a matter of hours. When these storms hit, the ordinary routine of the ship was instantly shattered. The merchants had to bind themselves to the wooden benches to keep from being washed overboard by the colossal, freezing waves, because their monoxylons lacked the high, protective decks of larger Western ships. Water would constantly pour over the sides, threatening to swamp the vessel and sink their precious cargoes of heavy furs and chained captives. Men had to bail out the freezing water using small wooden scoops. For hours on end, their hands freezing and losing all sensation, knowing that if they stopped for even a few minutes, the sea would swallow them whole. For the Slavic captives chained in the dark, wet bellies of the boats, this sea, crossing was a uniquely miserable purgatory, tossed violently by the waves, soaked in cold salt water, and breathing the foul air of the cramped holds. Many did not survive the journey. The Russ viewed these losses not with emotional sorrow, but with the cold, detached calculations of businessmen. A dead captive was simply a lost profit, an ordinary piece of merchandise to be quietly slipped overboard into the dark, silent depths of the sea, leaving no trace behind. But after weeks of this exhausting, boring struggle against the elements, the nature of the air began to shift. The sharp, clean smell of the open salt sea was slowly replaced by something different. The faint, distant scent of burning charcoal, domestic livestock, and cooked food. The line of the southern horizon, which had been a flat, empty gray for so long, began to thicken and rise. The Russ navigators adjusted their rudders, following the contours of the Thracian coastline, their hearts beating with a quiet, suppressed anticipation. They knew they were approaching the center of the civilized world. And then, as they rounded the final promontory and entered the calm waters of the Bosphorus, the city appeared. Through the thinning morning mist, the golden walls of Constantinople rose from the water like a collective hallucination. To an ordinary merchant from the frozen north, whose understanding of architecture was limited to mud-daubed timber huts and simple wooden longhouses, the first sight of Constantinople was a profound psychological shock. It completely shattered their perception of everyday life and what was possible for human hands to build. Stretching across the horizon were miles and miles of monumental stone walls. The famous Theodosian walls, rising 40 feet high, studded with massive square towers that glittered in the early morning sun. Behind these protective barriers lay a vast, undulating sea of red-tiled roofs, marble palaces, grand aqueducts that spanned entire valleys, and colossal columns topped with statues of ancient emperors. Rising above everything else, dominating the entire sky, was the immense dome of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Its golden cross caught the sunlight, casting a brilliant, almost supernatural glow over the harbor. To the Russ, who worshipped old gods of the forest and the storm in quiet, blood-soaked groves, This city did not look like it had been built by ordinary men. It looked like the dwelling place of giants, a legendary fortress made of stone and gold that they called Miklagard, the great city. But entering this paradise was not a simple matter of sailing into the harbor. The Byzantine Empire was a highly sophisticated, bureaucratic machine that viewed these tall, rough northern merchants with a deep sense of suspicion and unease. The Byzantines remembered all too well that these same northern barbarians had occasionally come not to trade, but to raid, launching terrifying naval attacks against the city walls in years past. Therefore, the everyday life of a Rus merchant in Constantinople was strictly regulated by imperial law and treaties. The fleet of single-log boats was not allowed to enter the main harbor of the Golden Horn. Instead, they were directed to a specific enclave outside the city walls, near the monastery of St. Mama's. Here, under the watchful eyes of heavily armed imperial guards, the Rus had to beach their worn, muddy boats and set up a temporary camp. The rules were incredibly strict. They could only enter the city through specific gates, they had to be unarmed, and they could only enter in groups of 50 men at a time, escorted by an imperial official who monitored their every move. For the men from the north, stepping through the massive bronze gates of Constantinople was like stepping into another dimension. The noise alone was overwhelming, a chaotic, deafening roar of a metropolitan population that exceeded hundreds of thousands of people. The streets were paved with smooth, white marble that felt strange beneath their rough, leather-shod feet. They walked through bustling fora and crowded marketplaces where the air was thick with the exotic scents of roasting meats, heavy incense, foreign perfumes, and spices that they had never smelled before: cinnamon, pepper, and cloves. The people filled them with a sense of wonder and alienation. They saw Roman citizens, dressed in flowing robes of dyed silk, their skin smooth and clean, speaking in the sharp, rapid cadences of Greek. They saw dark-skinned merchants from Egypt, dark-bearded traders from the deserts of Arabia, and solemn monks in long black habits. It was a dizzying, vibrant tapestry of human existence that made their previous life in the isolated, smoky longhouses of Sweden feel incredibly small, dark, and boring. But the Rus were not here to be mere tourists. They were here to do business. They moved toward the great commercial heart of the city. The marketplace is supervised by the imperial prefect, ready to display the cargoes they had carried across thousands of miles of river and sea. They carried their bundles of glossy black sable pelts, their heavy barrels of sweet-smelling Slavic beeswax, and their lines of exhausted, silent captives. As they prepared to negotiate with the wealthy Byzantine buyers, the true purpose of their miserable, grinding journey was about to be realized. The ordinary products of the northern wilderness were about to be exchanged for the ultimate prize: the heavy, glittering gold, coins of the empire, the solidi, and the exquisite, shimmering silks that would transform the destiny of the North forever. Feel the immense scale of this ancient metropolis. Let the image of the golden dome wash over your mind and sink deeper into a quiet, undisturbed sleep as the merchants prepare to enter the grand markets of Miklagard. The heavy leather pouches of the northern Varangian merchants were finally packed to their absolute, bulging maximum capacity with the cold, solid, and deeply comforting weight of imperial Byzantine gold coins, their perfectly polished circular surfaces catching the dim, flickering amber light of the olive oil lamps inside the grand, stone-lined trading stalls of Constantinople, where the air was thick with the strange, exotic scents of foreign spices, burning charcoal, and wet parchment that completely overwhelmed the senses of men who had spent their entire lives in the quiet, smoky depths of the northern pine forests, turning this sudden immersion into global wealth, into an unforgettable, monumental experience that altered their perception of material reality forever and made the memory of their ancestral lands feel distant, as every single gold piece promised them an escape from the seasonal starvation, cold desperation, and crushing structural isolation that haunted their home valleys year after year, guaranteeing that their return would be met with immense celebration, newly elevated social status, and the absolute envy of rival clans who had never dared to navigate the perilous eastern trade routes. For months on end, the everyday life of these weary travelers had been defined by the monotonous, heavy rhythm of the eastern rivers, the bitter and stagnant smell of damp earth, and the miserable cold of the dark wilderness, making this sudden transition to an urban paradise feel completely surreal as they stood amidst the towering marble structures of the empire, far away from the simple mud-daubed timber huts and small longhouses of their ancestral Scandinavian homes, realizing that the sheer physical and mental exhaustion they had carried across thousands of miles of liquid highways was finally about to be rewarded with the ultimate prize that could transform their destiny, elevate their social standing among their kinsmen, and secure their family's survival for generations to come, transforming them from simple desolated raiders into highly respected international merchants who had crossed the known world, completely rewriting their personal histories while proving that the dangerous, unpredictable river networks were truly pathways to limitless wealth, ultimate power, and unmatched continental prestige. But now they stood at the very center of global wealth, watching their ordinary, raw commodities transform into something legendary, mythical, and infinitely precious, a realization that brought a profound, overriding sense of relief to every single member of the crew who had survived the dangerous voyage, though they quickly learned that navigating the intricate, highly sophisticated Byzantine economic machine was an entirely new kind of struggle that required an endless amount of patience, as the imperial officials viewed these large, rough northern traders with a deep sense of suspicion and regulated their every movement with strict, unyielding laws that allowed no room for error, personal negotiation, or deviations from the written imperial decree that controlled the economy with absolute iron authority, forcing them to understand that in this magnificent, sprawling metropolis, physical strength and raw courage were completely subservient to the ancient, calculated systems of imperial administration and legal oversight. To truly understand what it was like to conduct business in this monumental city, one must look past the glittering gold and see the dense, bureaucratic reality that governed every single market transaction outside the massive stone walls, where imperial law was enforced with absolute and unyielding precision by the watchful guards who stood at every gateway, ensuring that these intimidating foreign merchants remained entirely unarmed, entered the city gates only in tightly controlled groups of 50 men at a time, and never attempted to spend the night inside the sacred perimeter of the capital after the great bronze doors were officially locked for the evening, forcing them back to their river camps under the cover of darkness where they watched the massive city from afar, wondering at the sheer scale of a civilization that managed thousands of people with written words and strict gatekeeping protocols. The empire did not operate on trust, nor did it allow these large, intimidating northerners to simply barter as they pleased, forcing them instead to endure a slow, methodical, and incredibly boring process that required hours of standing in the humid Mediterranean heat, while official imperial clerks sat behind elevated marble tables, checking documentation, verifying identities, and meticulously cataloging every single item brought off the fleet of single-log boats, turning the vibrant energy of the marketplace into a grinding administrative waiting game that tested the merchants' discipline far more than any physical obstacle they had encountered on the open water or during the violent, rocky rapids of the Dnieper, demonstrating that the ultimate trial of their journey was not the physical threat of enemy ambush, but the exhausting, continuous monotony of imperial red tape. These clerks dipped their long reed pens into dark ink to carefully record every single pelt, every barrel of heavy wax, and every captive that changed hands under the watchful, unblinking gaze of the armed guards, turning what should have been a simple trade into an endless mountain of paperwork, while the imperial prefect supervised the scales, matching every transaction against standard official, weights to ensure that no fraud could take place, creating an environment of intense scrutiny that made the northerners feel small, exposed, and deeply alienated by a civilization that valued written records, high taxation, and state bureaucracy far more than individual bravery, maritime expertise, or physical strength, showing them that the power of Constantinople lay not just in its army, but in its absolute mastery over numbers, records, and systemic control. The Rus merchants brought forth their first great asset for imperial inspection, carefully untying the coarse leather bundles and spreading rows of deep, glossy black sable, silver fox, and soft marten pelts across the smooth, sunlit presentation tables for the Byzantine buyers to examine with cold, calculating, and completely indifferent eyes, a display of immense natural wealth that had been pulled directly from the frozen, silent northern forests, but was now treated as a premium status symbol by the sophisticated elite of the Eastern world, who were willing to pay astronomical prices just to display these luxurious furs on their ceremonial winter robes, showcasing their power to the entire royal court and reinforcing their aristocratic superiority over the common citizens through the display of rare exotic goods. To an ordinary northern hunter, tracking these animals through the silent, freezing forests of Sweden had been a lonely, exhausting, and often miserable chore that brought little excitement to their predictable winter routine. But here, in the shadow of the great palaces, these pelts were treated like a luxury asset of the highest caliber, valued for their warmth, texture, and rare beauty, creating a fascinating contrast between the rough, dirt-stained reality of the men who had harvested the furs and the clean, perfumed elegance of the Roman aristocrats who would eventually wear them during the grand imperial winter processions through the roaring city streets, entirely detached from the wild, frozen nature where these animals had lived and died, and completely ignorant of the immense human suffering required to bring these luxury items to their markets. The buyers ran their soft, perfumed fingers through the thick, heavy northern fur to check for any signs of decay, insect damage, or structural imperfections from the long, damp sea voyage, knowing that the emperors and high nobles would pay almost any price to line their ceremonial winter robes with these exquisite materials, turning this intense, slow scrutiny into a repetitive waiting game that was intensely, deeply boring for the exhausted crews, who just wanted to secure their gold profits, buy their provisions, and find a quiet place to rest their aching bodies after weeks of relentless ocean sailing across the volatile Black Sea, where storms destroyed many ships, making them realize that the true wealth of the empire was built upon the relentless consumption of resources gathered by foreign hands in distant lands. This intense, slow scrutiny turned the trading floor into a repetitive waiting game that was intensely, deeply boring for the exhausted crews, who just wanted to secure their gold profits, buy their provisions, and find a quiet place to rest their aching bodies after weeks of relentless ocean sailing across the volatile Black Sea, where their monoxylons had been tossed constantly by freezing waves, forcing them to survive on raw discipline and stale water while their skin turned raw from the salt spray. An ordinary reality of seafaring life that was entirely forgotten by the wealthy buyers who sat comfortably under the shaded silk awnings of the imperial market, casually dismissing the true value of the human effort and maritime skill that brought these invaluable treasures directly to their highly regulated commercial doorsteps. Next came the valuation of the wild Slavic beeswax, a substance that was incredibly ordinary, mundane, and commonplace to the forest dwellers who gathered it from hidden hives in the ancient trees, but functioned as a vital, non-negotiable necessity for the daily religious and civic life of the entire Byzantine Empire, as the grand, monumental basilicas and hidden stone monasteries of Constantinople consumed wax at an unbelievable rate, and the everyday life of the imperial church depended entirely on the steady, uninterrupted influx of these northern river shipments to keep thousands of holy candles burning day and night before the golden, glittering icons of saints, turning the dark interior spaces of the majestic churches into glowing, spiritual sanctuaries that represented the divine light of heaven on earth. The grand, monumental basilicas and hidden stone monasteries of Constantinople consumed wax at an unbelievable rate, and the everyday life of the imperial church depended entirely on the steady, uninterrupted influx of these northern river shipments to keep thousands of holy candles burning day and night before the golden, glittering icons, creating a continuous demand that turned this simple forest product into an essential commodity of state importance, which the imperial clerks tested with long iron spikes to ensure that the wax had not been adulterated with dirt, rocks, or animal fat during the long journey down from the northern outposts, sealing their transaction with a final stamp of official imperial ink that marked their ultimate commercial success, securing their profit before they prepared for the long journey back home. The blinding, majestic white marble towers and the immense golden domes of Constantinople slowly dissolved into a thick, low-lying gray mist as the fleet of single-log Varangian monoxylons turned away from the crowded imperial harbor of St. Mama's, their wooden hulls sitting incredibly low and deep in the restless, salty water of the Bosphorus due to the staggering weight of the pure gold solidi coins, and premium shimmering silks safely packed into the central storage chests, marking the official conclusion of their high-stakes seasonal trading operations and the sudden, bracing beginning of a grueling return trek through thousands of miles of hostile, unyielding river networks that promised to test every single ounce of their remaining physical endurance and collective mental resolve, forcing them to quickly shed their newly acquired urban sophistication and return immediately to the primal, defensive mindset required to survive the lawless wilderness that lay tightly packed between the glittering borders of the Roman Empire and the frozen shores of their ancestral Scandinavian homelands, knowing that any mistake along the way would mean total ruin. To fully comprehend what it was like to transition directly from the ultimate luxury of the Eastern Roman world back to the harsh, unforgiving realities of the wilderness, one must imagine the crushing, absolute exhaustion that immediately settled over the rowers as they turned their vessels directly against the powerful, unyielding downward currents of the Dnieper River, changing their daily routine overnight from monitored city trading in sunlit markets to a relentless, back-breaking physical struggle where every single mile of northern progress had to be fought for with raw muscle, calloused hands, and sheer human stubbornness that left their bodies completely broken by the time the evening sun dipped below the endless forest line, a brutal reality that stripped away all the romantic notions of wealth and glory, leaving only the grim determination of desperate men who knew that their physical survival depended entirely on their ability to maintain a flawless, rhythmic pace hour after hour without a single moment of rest, distraction, or structural failure in their equipment. The everyday life of the merchants was once again reduced to a primitive, highly repetitive battle against nature, a reality that stood in sharp, painful contrast to the short-lived comforts they had briefly enjoyed while drinking sweet Greek wine near the massive stone walls of Miklagard, forcing them to accept the miserable, damp conditions of sleeping on the cold, uncovered banks of the river every night, exposed to sudden autumn downpours, biting winds, and the constant, terrifying threat of nomadic Pecheneg ambushers who actively monitored the riverbanks looking for heavily laden trading fleets to raid, destroy, and plunder without mercy, turning every blind bend in the water into a high-stakes gamble for survival, where weapons had to be kept within arm's reach at all times, and where the constant, psychological pressure of being hunted made it impossible to ever achieve a state of true, peaceful rest during the short, freezing night cycles. This journey back was infinitely more boring and frustrating than the journey down, because the element of wild, adventurous anticipation was entirely gone, replaced instead by the dull, heavy pressure of protecting their massive wealth from the elements while navigating against the water, a mechanical process that required the men to row in perfect, unbroken synchronization for 12 to 14 hours a day without speaking a single word, their ears filled only with the endless, repetitive splash of the wooden oars against the dark current and the deep, rhythmic groaning of the strained timber hulls under the immense weight of the Byzantine treasure chests, an exhausting experience that stretched their sanity to its absolute limits as days melted into weeks with nothing to look at but the same dark line of pines and the same muddy water rushing relentlessly against their progress. The true nightmare of the return voyage began to unfold as the exhausted fleet finally reached the base of the massive Dnieper rapids, where the liquid highway ceased to be navigable, forcing the crews to disembark and begin the agonizing, thoroughly miserable process of portage, which required them to physically haul their heavy single-log boats out of the rushing water and drag them across miles of rough, rocky land, mud, and exposed tree roots using wooden rollers and thick leather ropes that cut deeply into their bleeding shoulders, all while under the constant, paralyzing fear that nomadic archers would strike from the dense brush while they were completely exposed and unable to defend themselves, creating a situation where every single step was a masterclass in pain, coordination, and survival, anxiety that left them completely physically hollowed out. Every single foot of progress through the portage zones was a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance, an ordinary but completely devastating aspect of the Varangian trade system that outsiders rarely understood, as men had to balance the extreme weight of the waterlogged timber hulls against the slippery, unpredictable terrain, knowing that a single slip or a broken rope could crush a man's legs or send a priceless chest of gold sliding into a deep rocky ravine, destroying months of hard work and sacrifice in a single fraction of a second, leaving the survivors stranded in a vast, indifferent green wilderness that swallowed human lives without a trace, reinforcing the grim reality that the acquisition of imperial wealth was always purchased with blood, sweat, and the permanent destruction of human health. As they pushed deeper past the rapids and entered the dense, silent forest zones leading toward the northern outposts, the weather began to turn visibly worse with each passing cycle, the autumn winds shifting into freezing gales that brought the first scattered flurries of early winter snow, a terrifying environmental development that signaled the impending freezing of the entire river system, meaning that if the merchants allowed their pace to slacken even for a single day, they would find themselves permanently trapped in the icy grip of the northern wilderness, thousands of miles away from their comfortable home valleys, forced to spend their hard-earned wealth just to purchase basic food and shelter from isolated, hostile local tribes who would see them as easy targets. The psychological weight of this race against the changing seasons turned their everyday life into a silent, high-strung prison, where personal animosities, hidden exhaustion, and the profound boredom of the endless pine landscape threatened to tear the social fabric of the crew apart, forcing the older, more experienced steersmen to maintain absolute iron discipline through strict scheduling, aggressive motivation, and the constant, vivid reminder of the immense glory, wealth, and generational security that awaited them once their wooden prows finally touched the familiar, rocky shores of their home fjords where their families waited, keeping them focused on the grand long-term prize rather than the immediate, crushing misery of their current physical state. They spoke very little during these dark, freezing weeks, their minds turning inward as they remembered the majestic, glittering sights of the Hagia Sophia and the grand imperial palaces, realizing that they had walked through the literal center of the civilized earth and were now carrying its literal wealth back into the primitive, unmapped spaces of the far north, a realization that filled them with a strange, lasting sense of dual identity, as they were no longer just ordinary northern farmers or simple seasonal raiders, but international agents of a massive, emerging trade network that was permanently bridging two completely different historical worlds, forever altering the cultural trajectory of their entire homeland through the influx of Mediterranean ideas, currencies, and technical skills. The small, muddy timber fortresses along the route, strategic outposts like Kiev, and the riverside strongholds that would eventually grow into the grand foundations of Novgorod, provided brief, vital moments of absolute security where the travelers could pull their boats onto the shore, repair the split wood, dry their damp clothing by massive hearth fires, and exchange news with other Varangian crews, who were either heading south or settling in for the long winter, offering a fleeting, comforting glimpse of familiar companionship and shared purpose in an otherwise hostile and alien world, allowing them to briefly remember what it felt like to be human and safe before forcing them back into the relentless routine of the river. These outposts were the physical evidence of the expanding Varangian commercial empire, slow, ordinary developments that were quietly transforming the vast Slavic hinterlands from a chaotic collection of scattered agrarian tribes into a highly organized, heavily defended political and economic entity that existed solely to facilitate, tax, and protect this incredibly lucrative river trade between the Baltic and the Mediterranean, proving that the wealth of Constantinople was not just enriching individual merchants, but was actively funding the birth of a powerful, long-lasting medieval state system that would dominate the Eastern European landscape for centuries to come, transforming the ancient trade route into a permanent spine of civilization. Let your mind drift completely into the deep, absolute stillness of the approaching northern night, as the weary Varangian merchants finally guide their battered, heavily laden ships into the calm, protected waters of the northern lakes, the freezing winter ice just beginning to form a fragile, silver crust along the quiet shoreline, signaling that their long, miserable, and intensely boring journey against the currents has finally come to a successful end, allowing you to close your eyes, slow your breathing to a perfect, tranquil rhythm, and sink into a heavy, profound sleep, surrounded by the ancient, comforting silence of the northern night, knowing that the treasures are safe, the hard work is done, and the warmth of the home hearth is finally within reach after a year of unimaginable trials and tribulations across the vast eastern world. The pale, icy dawn of the northern Baltic winter slowly cracked open across the frozen horizon, casting a cold, silver light over the crowded wooden longhouses and bustling trading docks of Novgorod, where the heavy, rhythmic thud of iron broadaxes and the dense, white clouds of human breath rising into the freezing air signaled the beginning of a massive, long-term preparation for the next seasonal cycle of the great Varangian trade expedition, an immense and highly organized commercial undertaking that had completely evolved from simple, opportunistic pirate raids into a highly sophisticated, permanent international trade network that linked the isolated, resource-rich forests of Scandinavia directly with the unimaginably wealthy, bureaucratic core of the Eastern Roman Empire, proving that the true power of these northern seafaring warriors lay not in their legendary capacity for mindless physical destruction, but in their brilliant, adaptive mastery of global logistics, maritime navigation, and long-distance economic manipulation. To truly understand what it was like to survive and thrive in this rapidly expanding river empire, one must look closely at the complex, deeply layered socio-economic structure of the regional trading outposts, where Norse chieftains, Slavic farmers, and Finnish fur trappers were forced by pure material necessity to cast aside their ancient tribal animosities and work in absolute, systematic harmony, to gather, process, and protect thousands of tons of raw wilderness commodities, such as heavy bundles of black sable pelts, massive barrels of pure forest beeswax, and columns of unfortunate captives, which were absolutely essential to secure the highly coveted Byzantine gold coins and luxurious silk garments that served as the ultimate foundation of political power, social status, and military dominance across the entire medieval northern world, turning these remote, muddy river settlements into vibrant, multi-ethnic hubs of proto-urban civilization that laid the permanent structural foundations for the historical rise of the early Kievan Rus state system. The everyday life of a Varangian merchant during the dark, freezing winter months was an incredibly intense, highly repetitive grind of physical preparation and strategic planning, far removed from the romantic myths of continuous drinking and celebratory feasting in the grand lordly halls, as every single day was strictly dedicated to the exhausting, meticulously boring task of inspecting, repairing, and upgrading their vast fleet of single-log monoxylons that had been severely battered, cracked, and structurally compromised by the violent rapids and rocky portages of the previous return journey, requiring the crews to labor for hours in sub-zero temperatures with boiling pine tar, green timber, and heavy iron rivets to ensure that every single hull was completely watertight and capable of withstanding the immense, crushing hydrodynamic pressures of the volatile river networks when the massive spring thaw finally arrived to rip open the frozen waterways. This prolonged period of winter confinement inside the timber fortresses was often deeply boring, frustrating, and psychologically miserable for the active, highly restless crews, who found themselves trapped within cramped, smoke-filled log structures for months on end, while the relentless northern blizzards howled outside the walls, forcing them to survive on simple rations of dried fish, salted meat, and stale rye bread, while desperately trying to keep their equipment free from rust and dry rot. A stagnant reality of maritime life that tested their mental discipline and internal cohesion far more than any sudden, violent clash of steel on the battlefield, as personal rivalries, financial disputes, and deep-seated claustrophobia threatened to tear the social fabric of the ship crews apart before the trading expedition could even begin its dangerous journey down the river. But the dark winter stagnation was instantly shattered when the sudden, thunderous cracking of the thick river ice signaled the arrival of the massive spring thaw, turning the static, snow-covered landscape of Novgorod into a roaring, dynamic torrent of liquid energy that immediately mobilized the entire population of the settlement as hundreds of heavily laden trading vessels were pushed down the wooden slipways into the rushing, muddy waters of the Volkhov River, beginning an incredibly complex, high-stakes logistical ballet where multiple independent merchant fleets merged into a singular, massive armada for mutual defense against the brutal nomadic tribes that waited in ambush further down the trade route, creating an awe-inspiring spectacle of human ambition that transformed the wild, untamed wilderness into a bustling international superhighway of raw commerce. As the massive Varangian fleet drifted smoothly past the endless, dark walls of the northern pine forests, the sheer scale of their commercial enterprise became undeniable, as every single vessel was packed to its absolute maximum physical capacity with the ordinary, raw materials of the forest that were destined to be transformed into premium luxury assets under the sophisticated economic machinery of Constantinople. a brilliant commercial strategy that allowed these seemingly primitive northern warriors to dictate terms to the wealthy buyers of the Mediterranean world, who completely depended on the steady, uninterrupted influx of northern commodities to maintain the daily religious, civic, and military operations of the entire Byzantine state apparatus, cementing a deep, permanent geopolitical interdependence that defied the geographical vastness of the continent. To an ordinary observer standing on the remote riverbanks, the sight of these large, heavily armed northerners navigating their low-slung wooden craft through the treacherous, unmapped water networks would have seemed terrifying and chaotic. But in reality, every single movement of the fleet was governed by a strict, unyielding system of maritime law and collective discipline that had been refined through generations of bitter trial and error on the open seas, ensuring that the rowers maintained a perfect, unbroken synchronization that allowed them to cover immense distances with maximum efficiency while keeping a constant, vigilant watch for any signs of hostile movement or sudden environmental hazards along the shifting shorelines of the river. The first major geopolitical milestone of their long southern trek was the grand fortress of Kiev, a strategically magnificent settlement perched high upon the steep, defensive bluffs overlooking the Dnieper River, which served as the ultimate gathering point, customs, house, and administrative command center for the entire Varangian trading empire, where the local rulers, descendants of the legendary Norse chieftains who had first conquered the river routes, collected heavy tribute from the surrounding Slavic tribes, reviewed the documentation of the passing merchant fleets, and provided a vital, heavily fortified sanctuary where the crews could rest their aching bodies, restock their vital provisions, and prepare their minds for the truly perilous journey through the lawless southern steppes that lay ahead. The transition past the safety of Kiev marked the official boundary between civilization and the wild, unpredictable expanse of the open plains, where the everyday life of the merchants turned into a high-strung, terrifying game of survival as they entered the ancestral hunting grounds of the fierce Pecheneg nomads, a highly mobile, horse-riding warrior culture that viewed the heavily laden, slow-moving Varangian river fleets as their ultimate seasonal prey, forcing the merchants to maintain an absolute, exhausting state of military readiness at all times, with their heavy iron mail shirts permanently donned and their round wooden shields lined up tightly along the gunwales of the boats to form a continuous, floating wall of defense against sudden showers of horse-archer arrows. The absolute apex of this systemic danger occurred at the legendary Dnieper Rapids, a series of 7 monumental, rocky obstructions where the river transformed into a boiling, white-water nightmare that was completely unnavigable by any vessel, forcing the exhausted Varangian crews to execute the agonizing, thoroughly miserable process of portage under the direct, constant threat of total annihilation, as they had to physically drag their massive, waterlogged single-log boats over miles of rough, slippery terrain, while simultaneously maintaining a heavily armed defensive perimeter to repel the sudden, lightning-fast cavalry charges of the Pechenegs, who routinely hid in the dense brush surrounding the rapids specifically to slaughter the vulnerable merchants while they were physically pinned down by the immense weight of their own trade cargo. The sheer human suffering, raw physical exhaustion, and intense psychological terror experienced during these portage operations were simply beyond the comprehension of the wealthy, comfortable citizens of Constantinople, who would eventually purchase the goods brought through this gauntlet of fire and blood, as men frequently dropped dead from pure cardiovascular exhaustion under the burning summer sun, their bodies buried hastily in shallow, unmarked graves along the rocky riverbanks before the remaining survivors were forced to push onward without a single moment of mourning, driven by the absolute, overriding knowledge that a single day of delay would allow the nomadic hordes to gather in overwhelming numbers and seal the fate of the entire expedition. Let your mind drift completely into the profound, heavy silence of the deep historical past, as the surviving Varangian vessels finally push past the final rocky rapid and break out into the calm, open waters of the Black Sea, the vast, shimmering blue horizon stretching out before them like a boundless highway of limitless opportunity, signaling that the most miserable, terrifying, and intensely exhausting portion of their commercial journey has finally been overcome, allowing you to slowly close your eyes, relax your tense muscles, and sink into a deep, completely tranquil sleep, safely wrapped in the ancient, comforting memory of the great rivers of gold that built the foundations of empires. The boundless, shimmering turquoise horizon of the Black Sea finally began to narrow into the dramatic, rocky jaws of the Bosphorus Strait, where the distant, awe-inspiring silhouette of Constantinople's monumental stone walls and the colossal, glittering golden dome of the Hagia Sophia slowly rose through the warm morning mist like a mythical island of infinite wealth, signaling to the battered, salt-encrusted Varangian crews that their terrifying gauntlet through the lawless nomadic steppes was officially over, and that they had successfully guided their deeply laden fleet back to the literal center of the civilized universe, where the ordinary, raw commodities of the northern wilderness would once again be meticulously transformed into mountains of pure imperial gold, solid and exquisite, shimmering silk, fabrics that would permanently cement their family's high aristocratic status and political dominance across the entire medieval world for generations to come, a historical moment of pure relief and soaring personal ambition that deeply redefined how these men perceived the balance of global power, wealth, and destiny, knowing that every single scar on their bodies, every broken oar, and every moment of extreme thirst was about to be repaid with the legendary and unmatched treasures of the Eastern Roman Empire, which would completely shift the fortunes of their clans back home in the far-frozen reaches of Scandinavia, making them legends among their own peers who had never braved the great southern waters. To truly understand what it was like to survive this final, high-stakes maritime approach, one must look past the romantic legends of effortless conquest and see the intense, highly regulated system of imperial border control that immediately swept over the northerners as their low-slung, single-log monoxylons entered the heavily guarded waters of the Golden Horn, where majestic Byzantine dromons with lethal tube-mounted Greek fire systems cruised the harbors with absolute authority, forcing the intimidating foreign merchants to anchor in tightly designated zones outside the city proper, submit to rigorous health inspections, and wait patiently while elite imperial scribes boarded the vessels to meticulously record every single human life and commercial asset before granting official permission to step onto the sacred stone docks, an administrative reality that stripped away any illusion of northern dominance and replaced it with the cold, clear truth that they were entering a massive, highly bureaucratic civilization that viewed them as formidable barbarians who needed to be strictly counted, heavily monitored, and thoroughly regulated at every single point of interaction to prevent any sudden outbreaks of violence or political instability within the heart of the empire's capital. The everyday life of the merchants instantly shifted from a brutal, open-air battle against the elements into a slow, thoroughly boring maze of Mediterranean state bureaucracy and strict urban segregation, as the suspicious Roman authorities strictly enforced ancient security decrees that forbade any northerner from entering the capital carrying weapons of any kind, restricted their moving groups to a maximum of 50 men at any given time under armed imperial escort, and legally compelled every single foreign trader to evacuate the inner city before the massive bronze gates were officially slammed shut and locked at the exact moment of sunset, turning their nights into a repetitive routine of gathering around campfires at the guarded settlement of St. Mama's, listening to the distant, solemn chanting of monks drifting over the high stone battlements, an isolated and highly frustrating social reality that made the northerners feel small, alienated, and deeply trapped within an ancient system that valued paperwork, rigid hierarchies, and systematic laws far more than individual bravery, tactical brilliance, or physical strength, forcing them to learn the difficult art of absolute patience, in a world governed by ink rather than the cold iron of swords. This period of commercial transaction was incredibly tedious, exhausting, and mentally miserable for the restless northern warriors who had to spend weeks standing under a blistering southern sun while cold, perfumed Byzantine buyers ran their delicate fingers through bundles of thick black sable, silver fox, and soft marten fur to check for microscopic structural defects or signs of damp decay from the long sea voyage, calculating prices with mathematical precision using official imperial scales that allowed absolutely no room for informal blood oaths or traditional northern bartering, making the northerners realize with a deep, lasting sense of cultural alienation that the true power of this immortal empire lay not in raw physical bravery, but in its total, systemic mastery over numbers, written, ledgers, and institutional law, which ground down their patience day after day, as the endless waiting games in the humid markets tested their internal discipline far more than any violent clash of shields on the riverways, transforming their dream of quick riches into a long, drawn-out administrative struggle against clerks who cared nothing for their maritime achievements or the deadly rapids they had crossed to deliver these rare luxury goods. Yet all the crushing boredom and systemic humiliation dissolved into a profound, overriding sense of triumph when the final tallies were completed by the imperial prefect, and the merchants finally held the heavy leather pouches filled to absolute capacity with solid, polished Byzantine gold, alongside bolts of vibrant, state-produced purple silk that felt completely weightless and magical to hands that had only ever known the rough, scratchy utility of unwashed northern wool, a material luxury so incredibly rare and restricted that back in the smoky longhouses of Scandinavia, a single strip of this brilliant dyed fabric would instantly elevate a man to the status of a living king among his peers, serving as permanent visual proof that he had successfully conquered the liquid roads of the world and negotiated with the emperors of the earth, a tangible manifestation of ultimate prestige that would fund new trading posts, purchase massive tracts of land, and secure alliances with the most powerful chieftains across the entire Baltic region, forever changing the political map of the north through the sheer influx of southern wealth. With their grand commercial business officially concluded for the cycle, the thoughts of the Varangian travelers turned intensely and rapidly toward the long road back to the frost, as the shifting autumn winds and the changing angles of the stars warned them that the continental rivers would soon begin to freeze solid, turning their liquid superhighways into immovable blocks of ice that could trap them in foreign territories for a miserable, dangerous winter, prompting the steersman to order immediate repairs on the worn oars, secure the heavy iron chests at the exact center of gravity of the boats, and prepare the entire crew for the grueling return journey against the relentless downward currents of the great rivers, rowing with a heavy, unspoken focus toward the familiar, welcoming smoke of their home hearths, knowing that the journey back would be twice as physically punishing as the journey down, yet driven by an intense, burning desire to see their families and place their hard-earned treasures into the safety of their ancestral lands before the dark hand of winter completely closed over the northern hemisphere. The return voyage was an ordinary but devastatingly repetitive grind of pure physical muscle and sheer human stubbornness, as the men had to spend 14 hours a day locked in a silent, synchronized rhythm against the rushing water, their shoulders aching with a constant, dull pain, while they navigated past the same endless walls of dark pine forests, the initial adventurous excitement of the journey, completely replaced by the heavy psychological burden of protecting their massive gold wealth from the continuous threat of nomadic ambushes and environmental disasters, turning their everyday life into a high-strung prison of constant vigilance where weapons were never allowed to leave an arm's reach, even during the freezing, exhausted hours of the night when they camped on the damp earth under their cold gaze of unfamiliar stars, listening closely to every snap of a twig or splash in the dark stream, knowing that the wealth they carried made them the primary targets for every desperate bandit and nomadic war party across the vast continental plains. When the battered fleet finally reached the vast, peaceful waters of Lake Ilmen, and the familiar timber fortifications of Novgorod came into view through the low winter clouds, a deep, collective wave of emotional relief washed over the entire crew as they realized they had achieved what most of their kinsmen only ever dreamed of in whispered winter tales, returning alive as wealthy international. Merchants who had bridged two completely distinct historical worlds, ready to distribute their gold, tell their grand cinematic stories by the roaring fires of the longhouses, and officially establish the permanent structural foundation of a massive commercial empire that would permanently dominate the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe for centuries to come, proving to history that their legacy was not one of mere destruction, but of an incredibly complex, resilient, and far-reaching network of trade that connected the wild, frozen edge of the world directly with the grand golden halls of the Roman Caesars. Let your mind drift completely into the profound, absolute stillness of the deep northern winter, as the great wooden doors of the longhouse are safely barred against the howling blizzards outside. The warm, comforting amber light of the hearth fire casting long, dancing shadows across the heavy timber beams and the glittering chests of Byzantine gold that sit securely at the foot of your bed, signaling that the long, miserable, and intensely exhausting journey across the rivers of gold has finally reached its perfect, triumphant conclusion, allowing you to slowly close your eyes, relax every single tired muscle in your body, and sink into a deep, completely tranquil sleep, wrapped in the eternal, protective silence of the northern night, completely detached from the struggles of the rivers and the markets, safe in the warm embrace of home. As the crackling logs in the fireplace settle into a soft, glowing bed of deep red embers, casting a gentle, soothing warmth throughout the quiet room, you can feel the heavy residual tension of the long, treacherous voyage completely melting away from your mind and body, leaving only a profound sense of absolute security, deep peace, and complete fulfillment as the soft, repetitive whispering of the winter wind outside the thick walls acts as a gentle, rhythmic lullaby that guides your consciousness further away from the waking world, allowing you to completely surrender to the peaceful, undisturbed rest that you have so rightfully earned through months of relentless effort, raw discipline, and unwavering determination across the dangerous waterways of the world. The great silver coins and gold solidi remain perfectly still inside their locked iron-bound chests, their metallic surfaces no longer reflecting the chaotic, burning sun of the southern markets, but instead resting quietly in the peaceful darkness of the northern night, a silent testament to a monumental journey that has successfully concluded, ensuring that your mind has absolutely nothing left to worry about, no horizons to watch, no rapids to fear, and no administrative lines to endure, leaving you completely free to let go of every remaining thought and gently drift deeper and deeper into a state of total, unbroken relaxation that will last until the distant return of the spring sun. The entire village has fallen completely silent under the heavy, thick blanket of the freshly fallen snow, which smothers all sounds of human labor, footsteps, and distant animals, wrapping the entire geographical landscape in an absolute, sacred quietude that perfectly matches the deep tranquility growing within your own heart, making this exact moment the perfect time to let your breathing slow to an effortless, natural pace, allowing yourself to sink deeper into the soft, comforting layers of furs as you embrace the beautiful, total darkness of a deep, restoring sleep that connects you directly with the ancient, peaceful spirit of the northern wilderness. The roaring, crackling logs inside the massive, stone-lined hearth of the Grand Chieftain's Hall gradually transformed into a soft, glowing bed of deep crimson embers, casting a warm, comforting amber light across the thick timber beams, the iron-bound shield walls, and the heavy locked chests of pure Byzantine gold that sat securely at the absolute center of the room, signaling the final, magnificent closure of an entire generation of perilous river expeditions that had successfully bridged the vast, unmapped wilderness of the far north with the glittering, hyper-bureaucratic palace halls of the Eastern Roman Empire, proving that these seasoned Varangian merchants had fundamentally rewritten the economic destiny of their people through unmatched maritime discipline, long-distance logistical brilliance, and an unyielding, iron-willed survival instinct that permanently elevated their lineages from ordinary seasonal farmers into the supreme, undisputed architects of a legendary transcontinental trading empire that would echo through human history for centuries to come, a historical milestone of pure relief and soaring personal ambition that deeply redefined how these men perceived the balance of global power, wealth, and destiny, knowing that every single scar on their bodies, every broken oar, and every moment of extreme thirst was about to be repaid with the legendary and unmatched treasures of the Eastern Roman Empire, which would completely shift the fortunes of their clans back home in the far frozen reaches of Scandinavia, making them legends among their own peers who had never braved the great southern waters, ensuring that their names would be sung by the skalds in the great halls for centuries to come, as the men who tamed the wild rivers and brought the sun of the south into the dark nights of the frozen north. To truly appreciate what it was like to look back upon this monumental historical achievement from the quiet sanctuary of old age, one must imagine the deep, reflective silence that settled over the veteran steersmen as they watched the young boys of the village carefully lift, clean, and oil the massive wooden oars that had once fought relentlessly against the crushing whitewater rapids of the Dnieper River, a visual reminder of an incredibly intense, exhausting, and often miserable past life that had now been fully converted into absolute political security, generational wealth, and an unmatched social prestige that allowed their children to grow up far away from the crushing structural isolation, seasonal starvation, and desperate poverty that had haunted the older generations before the great. Southern trade routes were systematically conquered and opened to the Baltic world, transforming their entire society from a desperate gathering of isolated raiding clans into a sophisticated commercial elite capable of projecting economic power across thousands of miles of liquid highways, a profound change that was written in every sturdy timber of the newly expanded trading post, in every piece of silver jewelry worn by the village women, and in the confident, proud gazes of the young warriors who looked at the old veterans not just as fierce fighters, but as visionary leaders who had successfully crossed the known world to secure the ultimate prize of civilization. The everyday life of these legendary travelers was now defined by a peaceful, profound tranquility, a luxurious reality that stood in sharp, beautiful contrast to the raw physical torture, bitter freezing winds, and constant, high-stakes psychological terror of their former river journeys, allowing them to spend their long winter evenings comfortably wrapped in heavy, exquisite Byzantine silks that still carried the faint, exotic scent of foreign Mediterranean spices, a material luxury that served as an unblinking, permanent testament to their historical journey, showing every visitor who entered the grand timber hall that the old men sitting quietly by the fire were the very same warriors who had successfully negotiated face-to-face with the powerful Caesars of Constantinople, navigated the dangerous, lawless steppes, and brought the literal wealth of the civilized universe into the frozen heart of the north, a reality that completely detached them from the mundane struggles of ordinary farming or basic local bartering, lifting them into an aristocratic realm where their daily thoughts were no longer occupied by survival, but by the grand management of their vast commercial legacy, the distribution of wealth to loyal followers, and the steady education of the next generation of navigators who would inherit this massive continental trade network and keep the rivers of gold flowing continuously for decades. This final stage of their lives was beautifully slow, calm, and entirely free from the tedious, thoroughly boring administrative waiting games, the endless mountains of imperial paperwork, and the intense, suspicious scrutiny of the Byzantine market clerks that had once ground down their patience under the blistering southern sun, as they no longer had to prove their legal worth, verify their identities, or stand unarmed before the high bronze gates of foreign capitals. Having officially transitioned from vulnerable outsider merchants into the celebrated, wealthy patriarchs of a rapidly expanding northern civilization that was actively using Roman gold coins and Mediterranean technical skills to fund the grand, permanent construction of powerful early medieval state systems across the entire Slavic hinterlands, proving to history that their long-term impact on the world was not built upon the fleeting terror of mindless violence or random coastal plunder, but upon a sophisticated, enduring system of international trade, diplomatic relations, and structural state building that permanently linked the Baltic Sea with the golden palaces of the Mediterranean, altering the cultural and political alignment of Eastern Europe for all time. The great silver and gold solidi coins remained perfectly still and undisturbed inside their heavy iron-reinforced storage chests, their highly polished circular surfaces no longer catching the dim, flickering amber light of the olive oil lamps inside the crowded trading stalls of St. Mama's, but instead resting in the absolute, deep darkness of a secure home fortress, a silent, powerful manifestation of ultimate economic success that would ensure their family's dominance for generations, funding new trade alliances, purchasing massive tracts of fertile land, and guaranteeing that their ancestral home would never again fall prey to the unpredictable shifts of local tribal warfare or the devastating famines of the unpredictable subarctic winters, an accumulation of capital so massive and unprecedented that it acted as a permanent economic shield for the entire region, drawing artisans, weaponsmiths, and foreign merchants to the growing markets of Novgorod, turning the once isolated timber outpost into a legendary continental crossroads where the wealth of Rome met the wild resources of the Arctic Circle. Let your mind drift completely into the profound, absolute stillness of this final, eternal winter night, as the thick outer doors of the Grand Hall are permanently barred against the freezing, howling northern blizzards, wrapping the entire geographical landscape in a soft, heavy blanket of thick snow that smothers every single sound of human labor and animal movement, creating a perfect, sacred environment of total quietude that beautifully mirrors the profound peace, absolute security, and total fulfillment growing within your own heart, making this exact moment the ultimate time to let your breathing slow to an effortless, perfectly natural rhythm, allowing yourself to sink deeper and deeper into the soft, comforting layers of rich furs as you completely surrender to the beautiful, heavy darkness of a deep, restoring sleep that will last until the distant return of the spring sun, totally disconnected from the physical, exhausting realities of the ancient world, safe in the warm, unshakable knowledge that your journey is completely done and your victory is eternally preserved in the stone and gold of history. As your consciousness gently drifts further and further away from the waking world, the memory of the wild, churning river rapids, the heavy leather pouches of gold, and the glittering icons of the grand southern basilicas slowly dissolve into a soft, beautifully warm mist of absolute tranquility, leaving your mind completely free from any remaining thoughts, worries, or horizons to watch, knowing with absolute certainty that the long, miserable, An intensely exhausting journey across the rivers of gold has reached its absolute, perfect, and unshakable historical conclusion, leaving behind a legacy that will never fade, a wealth that is entirely secure, and a deep, comforting silence that safely encloses your soul in the eternal embrace of the northern night, completely protected from the cold. Wines of time, allowing you to rest with the profound dignity of a conqueror who has returned home to stay. The great single-log monoxylons that had once carried the weight of an emerging empire now rest quietly beneath thick roofs of protective timber along the peaceful shores of Lake Ilmen, their seasoned oak hulls completely frozen into the silver, fragile crust of the winter ice, no longer tossed by the volatile waves of the Black Sea or dragged across miles of rough, rocky portage trails, but instead sharing the absolute, tranquil rest of the men who built them, a perfect material symbol of a monumental historical cycle that has successfully come to an end, allowing the entire world to sink into an undisturbed, deep sleep beneath the stars, while the dark forest whispers its ancient secrets to the cold wind, completely at peace with the changing of the eras. The flame of the final candle gently flickers one last time before dying out completely, leaving the room illuminated only by the soft, warm, and deeply soothing red glow of the dying hearth embers, a gentle light that caresses your closed eyelids and signals to your body that it is time to completely let go of the physical world, to release every last bit of muscular tension, and to sink entirely into the profound, unshakable sanctuary of a deep, dreamless rest that connects you directly with the timeless, protective spirit of the ancient northern wilderness, safe at home, forever at peace, completely fulfilled, as the deep crimson shadows dance slowly across the room like the protective ghosts of your ancestors, ensuring that your sleep remains deep, undisturbed, and entirely sacred throughout the long, cold, subarctic night. The entire village has fallen completely silent under the heavy, thick blanket of the freshly fallen snow, which smothers all sounds of human labor, footsteps, and distant animals, wrapping the entire geographical landscape in an absolute, sacred quietude that perfectly matches the deep tranquility growing within your own heart, making this exact moment the perfect time to let your breathing slow to an effortless, natural pace, allowing yourself to sink deeper into the soft, comforting layers of furs as you embrace the beautiful, total darkness of a deep, restoring sleep that connects you directly with the ancient, peaceful spirit of the northern wilderness, a world completely decoupled from the chaotic noises of modern life, where time itself seems to slow down and freeze into an immortal monument of pure, unadulterated peace. Every heavy chest of imperial treasure, every strand of precious dyed silk, and every weapon hanging on the wall stands as a silent guard over your deep slumber, their material presence offering a profound, wordless assurance that the future of your bloodline is completely safe, and that the brutal trials of the past have achieved their absolute, perfect justification, leaving absolutely no room for doubt, anxiety, or restlessness in your soul as you descend further into the quiet depths of the night, your mind floating effortlessly like a ship on a perfectly calm, mirror-like ocean that stretches out into the beautiful, endless expanse of eternity, completely free from the weight of mortality and the struggles of the world. So let the cold northern wind howl as loud as it wishes outside the thick, protective logs of your home, for its bitter voice can never penetrate the deep, radiant warmth of the sanctuary you have built with your own two hands, an everlasting fortress of peace and luxury that welcomes you into its arms tonight, guiding your spirit through the starlit pathways of deep sleep where the rivers of gold finally empty into a boundless sea of absolute, perfect, and eternal tranquility. Good night, weary traveler. Your long and magnificent voyage is officially over, and the eternal peace of the North is finally yours to keep forever.